Today's video is sponsored by reading, the ultimate cure for depression. Unless, of course, you're Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, or George R.R. Martin. Hello everyone, my name is Thomas White, and this is Thomas Writes. Today we are going to be talking about On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness by Andrew Peterson. This is the first book in the Wingfeather Saga, which is a children's fantasy series. Andrew Peterson is best known for his work as a Christian musician. He does some great work in that area. And this is a series that has been highly recommended to me by several friends of mine. It originally came out in 2008, but there is an animated adaptation of the series that will be coming out later this year. So in anticipation of that, I figured now would be the best time to start reviewing the series. Before I get into the review, be sure to like and subscribe. I post new videos every Saturday, and comment down below on what books you think I should review next and what you thought of this video. The story takes place in the fantasy world of Airwear and follows the Igby family who live in the quiet town of Glipwood. Their continent is under the oppression of snake lizard men called Fangs, who serve an evil dark lord. The Igby family go about their normal life when suddenly an encounter with one of these Fangs leads the Igby children to discover that their family lineage may not be what they have been told. Even though some people may be put off by the fact that it is a story written for children, I wanted to check it out nonetheless because, frankly, I think all of us, no matter how old we are, should still have room in our hearts for children's stories. And just because a story is written primarily with children in mind does not inherently make it a better or worse story. There are plenty of stories written for adults that are terrible, and there are plenty of stories written for children that are great. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. Kicking us off, I wanted to give a bit of a content guide, and with the Wingfeather Saga books, I have no problem recommending these books to anyone. There is no content in there that I think would be upsetting to anyone. There is a little bit of violence, there's a little bit of darker themes, but it is written in such a way that children can handle it. It is not so grotesque or over the top that I think children would be scared by it or off-put by it. And there's no foul language, there's nothing that even borders on suggestive content. The author does a great job of keeping his story clean and family-friendly. Getting into the review itself, I want to start by talking about the world building. And from the very first page of this book, it is clear the kind of tone and world that Andrew Peterson is trying to establish. I've heard people compare this book's sense of humor to The Princess Bride, and I think that is an apt comparison. Andrew Peterson is very witty in his dialogue and in the way he establishes his world. He plays off of a lot of common fantasy tropes in clever ways. The world building of this book is mostly done through the footnotes, which some people may find annoying. If you've read other big fantasy books like Lord of the Rings or Wheel of Time, you know that you have to flip back to the glossary a lot to understand the world because they're just so big. The worlds are so big that you need these encyclopedias attached at the end in order to understand them. And Andrew Peterson very cleverly plays off of this idea by using the footnotes to describe his world, but in a way that's very humorous. Every footnote feels like a side joke, kind of like an aside in a comedy sketch. It helps flesh out the world while simultaneously establishing the goofy, lighthearted tone of the story. And even though there is so much humor throughout this book, I was very surprised to see just how dark it could get in some places. It was never at a point where I felt uncomfortable or felt like children would feel uncomfortable, but it still manages to maintain a heartfelt story in the midst of this goofy romp that's going on. The world building is not anything original for fantasy, but it is very much carried by that tone, by that humor. It sets it apart from other children's fantasy stories, which can sometimes feel like they're ripping off of other famous fantasy stories or feel not appropriate for children. Andrew Peterson does a great job of having a story that can appeal to both adults and to children. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the characters. And the characters in the Wingfeather Saga are all pretty good. Andrew Peterson does a great job of endearing you to the children in particular. Janner, the oldest son, is our perspective character. He is the one we spend the most time with. And as someone who is the eldest brother in my family, I could very much relate to his perspective on things. You can understand the decisions that he makes as an older brother, the responsibility but also the burden that he feels towards his siblings. Likewise, Tink is your stereotypical awkward middle child, and Lily is just this radiant ball of sunshine who just fills every scene with so much joy because she is sweet and cute, but also very strong-willed and defiant, and that makes her just so great. My personal favorite character, however, would have to be Poto. He is the children's grandfather and also an ex-pirate, which in itself is already a hilarious concept. But even as funny as that premise sounds, it also allows the reader to get all of this emotional complexity from Poto that isn't quite there with some of the other characters. Poto is a great mentor figure. He can be warm and that typical grandfatherly figure to the children, but at the same time, he can be very fierce when he needs to be, and he carries a lot of guilt and resentment with him. I listened to the audio version of this book, and the voice that Andrew Peterson does for Poto is just so perfect. He has the most hilarious voice out of all the characters, but he can also have the most intimidating voice out of all the characters. Also, the Fangs are pretty good villains. They are bad guys who just love being evil. And even though I appreciate stories that give a bit more complexity and nuance to villains, I can also appreciate a story in which villains are just evil for the sake of being evil and love doing what they do. There are also a lot of side characters in the book that I think are really great. Of the side characters, I would have to say that Oscar the librarian is my favorite. Just the fact that he constantly quotes books all the time whenever he speaks is hilarious. Also, maybe a little too relatable, and I just love that aspect about him. Overall, given that this is a book made for children, there's a lot more depth to the characters than one would expect. The Igabys as a whole feel like a real family, and it is that strong family dynamic that really carries the rest of the story, and I'm eager to see where these characters end up as the series progresses. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the plot, and the plot of the story was surprising for a children's book. There was one big twist that I could see coming from a mile away. Again, that's not a big criticism, it is a kid's book, but there were a couple of twists that I did not see coming at all, which I was very shocked and surprised by. Typically in most fantasy like this, there's some kind of jewel or magical artifact that the bad guy is hunting after, and this book has that as well, but without spoiling anything, there's actually a really clever twist on that typical plot point. It's something that I wasn't expecting and is a good way to set up for future books. I did think the plot kind of meandered a bit in the middle part of the story, because a lot of the book is focusing on building up the town, building up the side characters, exploring the world, and establishing everything beforehand before the story really kicks into high gear. I understand why they did that. I just wish it had been a bit clearer in its direction. Also, the climax of the book is less focused on the action and more on pouring out all these huge reveals about the characters, their origins, and setting up the world. and everything for future books, which is both a pro and a con. I would have wished there was a little more focus on the action, but that's just me talking. I think the character reveals were great, and I think what they set up is very intriguing, so I'm curious to see what that leads into. And now comes the time where I'm going to go ahead and give my final rating. And for On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness, the Wingfeather Saga Book 1, it is a really solid start to a children's fantasy series. It is definitely elevated over others' children's books. The humor is very good, the characters are endearing, and the world is interesting enough to where I'm intrigued to see where things go next. There are a couple of little things I would have tweaked here and there, but overall I was very satisfied with this book. So I'm going to go ahead and give it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm very interested to see where the series goes, and my ratings may increase as I go through the series. This is just Act 1 of a 4-act story. Overall, I'm happy that I picked this up and can't wait to see where it goes next. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.